She entered the house without saying anyone's name, without asking what had happened. She looked directly at Ethan and took a deep breath, like someone acknowledging an interrupted destiny. The silence that followed was more intense than any words. The air inside the house seemed different at that moment, denser, almost still, as if it had stopped to observe along with her. Ethan felt his chest tighten without pain, just with a pressure difficult to explain, like when something old is touched without warning. The usual sounds of the farm disappeared, and all that remained was that silent presence before him, firm, lucid, impossible to ignore. He tried to hold her gaze, but something inside wavered. It wasn't fear of what she might do, it was the clear feeling of being seen in his entirety, without disguises, without defenses. His body remained still, but inside there was an intense movement, as if forgotten memories were slowly being pulled back to the surface. The spirituality of that moment didn't come from words or gestures, it came from their absence, from that which didn't need to be explained to be felt. The healer didn't approach, didn't touch, didn't promise anything. She simply remained there, breathing in the same rhythm as the space, as if awaiting a decision that didn't depend on her. Ethan realized, with a discreet chill running through his body, that this was neither an ordinary visit nor a last resort. The question that silently formed was simple and disturbing. What happens when the body stops resisting and the interrupted story demands to continue? He still dreamed of the long porch of the big house, the wood creaking as if remembering every step that was no longer coming. In the dream, Ethan Caldwell ran barefoot after his father among the shadows of the barn, smelled the warm scent of hay, leather, and old rain, and laughed loudly as if the world had no weight. He always woke up at the same instant, when the laughter turned to silence and his body wouldn't obey. The room became a room again, the heavy sheet, the window showing the still hill. And deep down, there remained that strange feeling, a silent spirituality, as if something inside him was crying out for help without knowing how to ask. In 1968, Hazel Creek was too small to hide secrets, but proud enough to pretend not to see. Wooden fences marked the Caldwell lands like lines of destiny, and the surname was spoken with automatic respect, sometimes with envy, sometimes with fear. Ethan watched it all from the chair near the door, feigning interest in accounts, cattle, and harvest, while inside he felt his energy slowly withering like an ember without air. No one asked what truly hurt, because certain pains became taboo subjects, and he had the impression that his own life was turning into a thrilling story that no one wanted to tell aloud. Walter Caldwell had the hands of a commanding man and the voice of one who doesn't tolerate failure. When he entered the room, conversations would lower in tone without anyone planning it. He spoke of prosperity as one speaks of the weather, something achieved through work, discipline, and silence. But when his eyes fell upon his son, there was a second when his hardened face faltered, almost imperceptibly, as if an old guilt gnawed from within. Ethan saw that moment and hated it, because he preferred open anger to that twisted affection, that care that came too late. At night, when the pains returned, he wondered what kind of health remained when shame became routine. On the dirt road leading to the woods, there was a bend the locals avoided after sunset. They said the air there grew colder, not because of the wind, but because of memories that weren't of people. Ethan had heard this since he was a boy, and he laughed along until he lost his laughter. It was on that bend that, weeks before, he had smelled a different scent wafting through the car window, something between crushed roots and clean smoke, a smell that seemed to go straight into his head. The driver made the sign of the cross, gripped the steering wheel, and murmured almost voicelessly that the healer lived further ahead. Ethan wanted to ask her name, but the question died in his throat. That same early morning, while the farm slept, a faint light flickered in a secluded house, almost swallowed by the trees. Agnes Whitmore, the healer, stirred a glass jar as if listening to the liquid, not merely observing. There were rows of dry leaves, a bowl of dark water, a worn rosary, and an old piece of fabric carefully folded, as if holding a name that shouldn't be spoken. Everything there had rhythm, patience, and ancestral wisdom, without the hurry to convince anyone. She stopped suddenly, her finger suspended in the air, and looked at the door before any sound. Outside, a raven landed on the doorframe and tapped its beak twice, as if a warning. Ethan woke with the feeling that someone had entered the room during the night, not because of the noise but because of the different, heavier, almost watchful air. He lay motionless, staring at the ceiling, trying to decide if it was just his imagination or accumulated fatigue. Since the accident, he had learned to doubt his own senses, as if trusting them too much was a risk. Still, there was something insistent that early morning, a strange energy that didn't match the usual silence of the farm. He closed his eyes again and thought that certain presences don't need footsteps to be noticed. The next morning, Hazel Creek seemed the same, but it wasn't. Chickens pecked near the barn. The wind stirred the tall grass, and the workers greeted Walter Caldwell with the same respect as always. But Ethan noticed averted glances, interrupted sentences, and exaggerated caution as they passed him. It was as if everyone knew something he hadn't yet been allowed to know. This irritated and saddened him at the same time, because growing up there had always meant learning to read silences. He wondered when he had lost that ability, or if he had never truly possessed it. Late in the afternoon, one of the oldest employees approached with a glass of water, his hands trembling despite the heat. He simply said that the previous night had been strange, that the dogs had barked at the woods for no reason, and that certain ancient things don't like to be awakened. Ethan tried to laugh, but the laugh came out short, broken. There was a weight in the man's words that didn't match simple superstition. When he was alone, he thought about how the spirituality of the region had always manifested itself in this way, through whispers and quick gestures, never in clear speeches. Meanwhile, in the isolated house near the trees, the healer carefully separated roots with almost ceremonial care. Her fingers were slender, marked by time, but firm as if she had already lived through many seasons. She didn't seem surprised by anything, just attentive. At certain moments she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, as if listening to something coming from afar, far beyond the sound of the nearby stream. There was no hurry, no visible expectation, only the silent certainty that some moving stories begin long before someone asks for help. Ethan spent the night awake, remembering the smell he caught on the road, the curve he avoided, the crow that seemed to be rattling inside his memory. He thought about his own body, the health that never fully returned, and an old guilt he couldn't name. For the first time in a long time, he considered that perhaps not everything there was just a consequence of broken bones and wrong decisions. When the clock struck 3 in the morning, he had the distinct impression that someone somewhere already knew exactly where this story was about to lead. The day dawned shrouded in an opaque sky, devoid of a defined color, as if the light had forgotten which direction to take. Ethan watched the landscape from the window, feeling his body heavy, not only from immobility, but from an inner sense of waiting that he couldn't explain. From early on, the distant sounds of the woods seemed more present, not loud, just constant, like a reminder. He thought that living there had always meant coexisting with silent forces, and that perhaps the spirituality of that place wasn't manifested in crowded churches, but in this kind of invisible pressure that settles in without asking permission. At breakfast, Walter talked more than usual, describing plans for the next harvest, investments, land expansion. The words came quickly, almost rushing, as if speaking was a way to avoid looking at his son. Ethan noticed and looked away, feigning interest in his cup. Prosperity there tasted of obligation, not joy. He wondered if his father also felt that strange unease in the air, or if he was determined to ignore anything that got out of control. There were moments when the silence between them seemed heavier than any argument. In the afternoon, a woman from the village appeared at the farm gate, asking for a simple favor, coarse salt and water. She spoke softly, looking around as if afraid of being seen. Before leaving, she commented almost in a whisper that she had dreamed of a house surrounded by trees and a young man standing before a path he couldn't cross. Ethan felt a shiver run down his neck, a cold energy that had no logical explanation. The woman said goodbye too quickly, leaving the feeling that she had said more than she intended. At that same time, the healer walked slowly to the edge of the stream, leaning on a smooth branch that served as a walking stick. She stopped, touched the water with her fingertips, and brought them to her nose, as if recognizing an ancient scent. Her face showed no astonishment, only a deep, almost solemn attention. There was something in that constant flow that spoke of destiny, of things that move even when they seem still. She murmured a few inaudible words, and the wind changed direction for a moment, carrying dry leaves away. As night fell, Ethan had an unsettling certainty that something was falling into place without his involvement. He felt as if every detail of the day had been orchestrated by a logic-defying reason. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, he thought that perhaps this wasn't just another strange memory to keep. There was a clear, almost physical premonition that the path that had closed years before was about to be forced open in another way, and that this change would not come without a cost. The following morning, the farmer woke to a different noise, not louder, just out of rhythm. The workers' footsteps seemed quicker, doors slammed shut carelessly, and even the animals showed restlessness. Ethan noticed this even before opening his eyes, as if his body perceived the atmosphere before his mind. There was a subtle tension in the air, something unseen but felt in his muscles, his stomach, his short breath. He thought perhaps it was just another difficult day, but a part of him knew that this feeling didn't come from nowhere. Walter left early to take care of business in town, leaving his son to follow a predictable routine. His father's absence brought an eerie silence to the large house, almost too respectful. Ethan took the opportunity to ask to be taken to the side porch, from where he could see the beginning of the trail that cut through the woods. It had been years since he'd stopped there. Observing the narrow path, covered in leaves and shadows, he felt a tightness in his chest, a mixture of fear and curiosity. It was like looking at something that had always been there, but that only now demanded attention. At noon, an older man appeared on the property bringing overdue mail. His face was wrinkled, his eyes too attentive for someone merely delivering papers. While chatting about trivial things, he let slip that the healer had been seen near the main road, a rare occurrence. He said it as if commenting on the weather, but his tone betrayed its importance. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine, a discreet yet firm energy. The idea that this woman, so distant until then, was becoming a part of the farm's daily life seemed absurd and, at the same time, inevitable. In the house by the woods, the healer prepared a small bundle of dried herbs, tied together with an old worn thread. Her movements were slow, almost meditative, and each gesture seemed to carry intention. There was no anxiety, only precision. At a certain moment she stopped, rested her hands on the table and took a deep breath, as if the weight of the years mingled with something deeper, coming from within. Her clear eyes, still alive despite her age, reflected an ancestral wisdom that needed no witnesses to exist. As the sun began to set, Ethan felt a brief dizziness, as if the world around him had lost its axis for a few seconds. He gripped the arm of the chair, closed his eyes and breathed slowly until the sensation passed. He didn't tell anyone. Inside him, an unsettling certainty formed that this exciting story was leaving the realm of memories to become something present, concrete, and that resisting might be as futile as trying to erase footprints in wet earth. Night fell earlier than usual, bringing with it a dense, almost watchful silence. The windows of the large house reflected the darkness like opaque mirrors, and Ethan found it difficult to concentrate on anything other than his own body. There was a diffuse unease, a feeling that something was moving beyond his sight. He tried to convince himself it was just tiredness, but the energy around him seemed to contradict him, insistent, like a thought that returns even when one tries to push it away. During dinner, few words were exchanged. Walter wasn't there, and the servants seemed to avoid any topic that strayed from the trivial. The clinking of silverware sounded too loud in that subdued atmosphere. Ethan realized that everyone was behaving as if they were expecting an unexpected visit, something unspoken but sensed. This made him uneasy, not out of explicit fear, but because of the strange familiarity of the situation, as if he had already experienced that moment in some old dream. Around midnight, a faint sound echoed through the house, a soft crackling coming from the direction of the porch. It wasn't wind nor an animal, just a short, deliberate noise. Ethan stood motionless, his heart racing, trying to decide whether to call someone. The sound didn't repeat itself, but it left an unsettling, almost respectful presence in the air. He had the distinct impression that whoever was there didn't intend to be seen, only to be announced. On the forest trail, the healer walked with difficulty, leaning on the branch that had accompanied her for years. Each step seemed to require a calculated effort, but there was no hesitation. She stopped a few times, closing her eyes, feeling the ground, as if conversing with something that needed no words. The bundle of herbs rested close to her body, warmed by the ancient heat of someone who had lived too long to be in a hurry. In the distance, the light from the farm stood out like a fixed point in the darkness. As the sound of footsteps faded, Ethan released the breath he hadn't even realized he was holding. The fear didn't turn into panic, only into certainty. He knew without knowing how that this night marked a silent turning point. Something had approached, not to threaten, but to demand attention. Lying there, eyes open in the darkness, he had the clear feeling that from then on, the choice to ignore it would no longer be available. Ethan struggled to fall asleep that night, his body exhausted and his mind too alert. Every creak of the house's wood seemed to carry intention, as if the place itself were attentive to his breath. At one point, he thought he heard a distant murmur coming from the woods, not like a voice but like an ancient echo carried by the wind. He tried to push the idea away, reminding himself that he had always lived surrounded by exaggerated stories. Still, there was something about that night that didn't fit with memory or imagination, something that touched him deeply. At dawn, the farm awoke under a strange atmosphere of forced normalcy. Coffee was served on time, the horses saddled, the men went about their tasks, but everything seemed slightly out of place, like a hastily assembled set. Ethan observed each detail with renewed attention, noticing how small routines concealed old tensions. For the first time, he felt that his condition was not just a physical problem, but part of something bigger, intertwined with that land, that family, decisions made long before he learned to walk. One of the younger employees commented, in a low voice, that he had seen someone near the fence during the early morning hours. He didn't describe a face or clothing, only that it looked like a shadow, moving too slowly to be an ordinary person. The comment died there, swallowed by the sound of the tractor starting. Ethan kept it to himself, feeling a tightness in his chest that mixed fear and curiosity. There was a strange sense of recognition, as if that presence were familiar, even though it had never been faced directly. In the house near the woods, the healer sat at the simple table and opened a small notebook with yellowed pages. She wrote nothing, only ran her fingers over the pages as if recalling old paths. She stopped at a page marked by an old fold and took a deep breath. Her eyes closed for a longer moment, and the silence around her seemed to adjust to the rhythm of her breathing. There was a decision there, made without haste, sustained by years of observation and the certainty that certain interventions cannot be postponed indefinitely. Late in the morning, Ethan asked to be taken back to the balcony overlooking the trail. The request surprised those who heard it, but no one questioned it. From there, he watched the narrow path, smelling the earth warmed by the sun. Something inside him stirred, a mixture of resistance and surrender. He couldn't explain it, but he had a clear feeling that this path, ignored for so long, was about to become inevitable, and that crossing it would change everything. The afternoon heat spread heavily over Hazel Creek, making the air seem thicker, difficult to penetrate. Ethan felt cold sweat trickle down his temples even without effort, as if his body were reacting to something his mind hadn't yet accepted. Observing the trail, he had the impression that it gradually narrowed, not physically, but in the way it demanded attention. It was an uncomfortable invitation, almost a silent provocation. He looked away, feeling that staring too long at that path might awaken something he wasn't yet ready for. Inside the large house, time seemed to move in circles. Clocks marked hours that didn't match the inner feeling, and the silence of the hallways sounded louder than conversations. Ethan thought of his childhood, of the days when he ran without thinking, and felt a lump in his throat remembering how quickly everything had changed. There was an old sadness there, mixed with anger and guilt, emotions he had learned to keep hidden, like someone hiding objects they no longer want to see. That day, however, these emotions resurfaced with renewed force, demanding recognition. Towards the end of the afternoon, an old neighbor appeared to speak with Walter, who had not yet returned. The man seemed nervous, his eyes restless, and commented that certain things were stirring in the woods, that it was not wise to ignore such signs. Ethan listened from a distance, feigning disinterest, but each word seemed to resonate within him. The idea that something was approaching, not as a clear threat, but as an unavoidable necessity, began to solidify. It didn't seem like superstition, but a warning wrapped in caution. In the secluded house, the healer opened the door to let in the golden light of the late afternoon. The simple interior revealed objects worn by use, each in its exact place, as if obeying an invisible order. She walked slowly to a high shelf and took down a small, almost empty vial, which she held with both hands for a few seconds. The gesture was one of respect, not urgency. There was a clear awareness that this preparation concerned not only the body, but something deeper, connected to the health of the spirit and the marks that time leaves. As the sun began to hide behind the hills, Ethan felt a sudden pain in his chest, brief but intense enough to make him close his eyes. It wasn't physical, not in the familiar way. It was as if a forgotten memory had been touched without permission. He took a deep breath, trying to compose himself while a silent certainty formed. That exciting story wasn't just being built around him, but inside him, and every resistance seemed only to reinforce what was to come. Walter's arrival in the early evening brought movement to the house, but not relief. His father spoke quickly, as if trying to regain control of something that had slipped away during the day, commenting on meetings, prices, and deals closed. Ethan listened in silence, noticing small flaws in his speech, pauses that were too short, a glass of water left on the table. There was tension there, unspoken, an unease that didn't match Walter's usual confidence. For the first time, Ethan thought that perhaps his father also sensed that something was out of place, even if he wouldn't admit it. After dinner, Walter asked the staff to retire early. He said he needed silence, but his tone carried another intention. When they were alone, he tried to talk to his son about doctors, travel, new treatment attempts. The words sounded empty, too repetitive. Ethan responded little, feeling a deep weariness, not of the body, but of promises that were never fulfilled. At one point, he almost asked about the healer, but he held back. Something told him that question would open a door that Walter didn't even want to see. Meanwhile, in the woods, the healer remained seated before the house, observing the dusk as if reading signs in an ancient book. The wind passed through the trees with a continuous, almost breathing sound. She touched the ground with her fingertips, feeling the dampness, the temperature, the subtle vibration that spread through the earth. There was no anxiety in her gestures, only full attention. It was as if she awaited an exact moment, not marked by clocks, but by an internal adjustment difficult to explain. In the room, Ethan had difficulty settling in. The pain in his legs seemed more distant than usual, replaced by a strange, almost imperceptible, tingling sensation. This alarmed him but also intrigued him. He closed his eyes and tried to focus on his breathing, remembering how he had learned to endure frustrations in silence. Still, a part of him wondered if this was just his body reacting to stress or if something more subtle was happening, something that didn't fit into medical explanations. Before falling asleep, he heard the sound again coming from the balcony, not a crack, but a slight dragging, like someone carefully leaning on something. His heart raced, but there was no panic. Just a quiet, almost respectful certainty that this presence wasn't there to cause harm. Ethan remained still, listening, while the night seemed to rearrange itself around that sound. Deep down, he felt that the next encounter, whatever it might be, was drawing ever closer. Dawn brought a colder air than usual for that time of year, surprising even the oldest residents of the farm. Ethan noticed this when he felt his skin crawl as the bedroom door opened. The cold didn't come from the weather, but from something harder to define, a sensation that passed through his body without touching his bones. He had the impression that the day was beginning with a silent warning, as if time itself were demanding attention. For the first time in a long time, he felt fear without knowing exactly what it was about. At breakfast, almost no one spoke. Walter left early again, avoiding eye contact with his son. The servants moved with exaggerated caution, as if any noise could break something fragile. Ethan realized that the silence had weight, that this absence of words spoke louder than any direct conversation. He thought about how the farm had always been a place of rigid order, and how now this order seemed threatened by something invisible. It was strange to realize that the greatest unease did not come from the possibility of change, but from the feeling that it had already begun. As the sun slowly rose, the healer opened the door of the house and let the light touch the simple interior. She walked to a corner where she kept old objects, calmly choosing each one, as if recalling stories by touching them. She stopped before a small mirror stained by time and observed her own reflection for a few seconds. There was no vanity there, only recognition. She took a deep breath and closed her eyes, as if confirming something she already knew from the previous night. In the early afternoon, Ethan felt an unexpected urge to leave his room, something he hadn't experienced in weeks. He asked for help to be led to the front door, ignoring the surprised looks of those accompanying him. As he crossed the threshold, the smell of earth and trees was stronger than usual, awakening an old, almost forgotten memory. His heart beat faster, not from physical exertion, but from the strange sensation of return, as if part of him was being called back to a place he had never ceased to belong. As the sun began to set, an old car stopped on the dirt road in front of the farm. No one announced its arrival, but everyone sensed it. Ethan was the first to notice, not from the sound of the engine, but from the sudden silence of the woods. From the vehicle, an elderly figure descended with difficulty, supporting herself on a smooth branch. Even from a distance, there was something about that woman's posture that commanded respect effortlessly. Ethan knew, before any introductions, that this encounter would mark a turning point in the story that had been unfolding. The car door slammed shut with a dry, simple sound, but enough to capture the attention of everyone around. The woman remained motionless for a few seconds, breathing calmly, as if adjusting to the place before moving forward. Agnes Whitmore, the healer, walked slowly to the fence, leaning on the branch with surprising firmness for someone her age. There was no hurry nor hesitation. Each step seemed chosen, conscious, laden with silent intention. Ethan felt his heart race, not from fear, but from a strange sense of recognition. When the healer raised her eyes toward the main house, the air seemed to contract slightly, as if the farm itself were reacting to her presence. The servants stopped what they were doing, some touching their hats, others averting their gaze. No one approached. The woman didn't ask permission, nor did she announce the reason for her visit. She simply waited, in silence, like someone who knows that certain doors open by themselves when the time is right. Ethan realized that this silence carried more authority than any word spoken aloud. From the balcony, Ethan watched every gesture with intense attention. There was something about that woman's posture that disarmed him, a kind of strength that required no proof. When her eyes finally met his, he felt a deep shiver, not of cold but of exposure. It was as if he were being seen in his entirety, defenseless, without disguises. The energy of that gaze crossed the space between them with disconcerting ease, bringing to the surface memories he preferred to keep buried. The healer moved a little closer and spoke for the first time, her voice low, firm, almost whispered, but perfectly audible. She said only that the path doesn't close forever. It only waits. She didn't explain, didn't elaborate, didn't look around for approval. The words hung in the air, dense, difficult to ignore. Ethan felt a lump in his throat, a mixture of hope and fear, as if that phrase had touched something ancient within him, something that had been silenced for years. When Walter finally appeared on the balcony, his hardened face tried to mask his discomfort. He greeted the visitor with restrained formality, asking what brought her there. The healer glanced at him only for an instant, long enough to make him hesitate. Then he replied, with almost disconcerting simplicity, that certain stories don't choose when to begin. Hearing that, Ethan knew that this visit was no accident, and that the invisible line between what he knew and what he feared was about to be crossed. Walter invited the healer inside, more out of pressure from the surrounding silence than out of his own volition. The gesture was stiff, rehearsed, as if opening the door meant admitting something he had avoided his entire life. The woman crossed the threshold slowly, leaning on the branch, and in doing so seemed to shift the air in the room, not abruptly, but as if rearranging a forgotten space. Ethan felt his chest tighten, not from pain, but from an uncomfortable expectation, as if something were about to be named without permission. Inside the large house, the healer observed everything with silent attention. The heavy furniture, the old portraits, the well-kept floors. She made no comments, showed no judgment. Her eyes lingered a little longer on the hallway leading to the bedrooms, as if she recognized an ancient presence there. Ethan noticed this gaze and felt a chill run down his spine. It was strange how this woman seemed to know the house without ever having been there, as if the history of the place were imprinted on something beyond the walls. Seated before him, the healer didn't ask what had happened, or when, or how. She simply placed her slender hands on the branch and said that certain pains settle in when something important is interrupted for too long. The phrase was spoken without accusation, without consolation, only as an observation. Ethan swallowed hard, feeling the energy of those words slowly spread, touching memories he avoided accessing. There was no promise there, only the feeling that something essential was being acknowledged. Walter tried to intervene, speaking of renowned doctors, exams, clear diagnoses. The healer listened in silence, her gaze attentive but distant, as if those words traveled a path parallel to what truly mattered. When he finished, she simply inclined her head and said that not all lack of movement originates in the body. The silence that followed was heavy, almost awkward. Ethan perceived his father's discomfort, but for the first time felt no guilt for it, only a strange clarity. At the end of that brief encounter, the healer rose with visible effort but without help. Before leaving, she turned to Ethan and said that if he wanted to understand what was happening, he would need to go to where the path begins, not where it ends. She explained nothing more. When the door closed behind her, the house seemed smaller, quieter than ever. Ethan remained motionless, feeling that that phrase had settled within him like a restless seed about to break through the ground. After the healer left, the house remained enveloped in an eerie silence, as if each room were absorbing what had been said. Walter paced back and forth, feigning normalcy, but his steps betrayed unease. Ethan watched his father, unsure how to react, feeling a subtle shift within himself, something that couldn't be put into words. The phrase about the path echoed insistently, touching a sensitive, almost forgotten point. It was as if that visit had displaced something invisible, opening up space for questions he had never allowed himself to ask. That night, Ethan dreamed again of his childhood, but the dream was different. He was no longer chasing after anyone. He stood before the forest trail, hearing his own name being called by a voice he neither recognized nor feared. Upon waking, he felt a mixture of unease and clarity, as if he had received an incomplete message. His body remained still, but the inner sensation was of slow, profound movement. There was a discrete energy reorganizing itself, silent, difficult to explain, but impossible to ignore. The next day, Walter announced he needed to travel for a few days to take care of urgent matters. The decision seemed too sudden, almost an escape. Ethan didn't comment, only watched his father walk away, realizing for the first time that this absence might be necessary. Alone in the big house, he felt the weight of his own choices, of the unspoken things, of the questions he had always avoided. The prosperity that surrounded everything there seemed empty in the face of the growing unease, demanding meaning, not control. In the woods, the healer walked with difficulty but with quiet determination. She stopped a few times to rest, leaning on a branch, breathing deeply, feeling the ground beneath her feet. At a specific point on the trail, she knelt with effort and touched the earth, closing her eyes. There were no words, just a simple gesture, full of intention. That place seemed to hold something ancient, a memory that didn't belong to a single person, but to many stories intertwined over time. At dusk, Ethan asked to be taken to the start of the trail, despite the resistance of his companions. When he arrived, he felt his heart beat faster, not from physical exertion, but from the certainty that this was the starting point of something he didn't yet understand. Observing the woods ahead, he realized that fear was beginning to mix with curiosity and a strange hope. He didn't know what he would find ahead, only that ignoring that call no longer seemed like an option. The start of the trail seemed narrower than Ethan remembered, not because of any actual change, but because of the way the space imposed itself on his perception. The trees leaned slightly, creating long shadows that moved slowly with the wind. The smell of damp earth mingled with something drier, almost bitter, awakening an old bodily memory. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the air fill his chest with difficulty, as if each breath demanded a silent decision. There was a discreet presence there, not threatening, just attentive, as if the place itself awaited his reaction. As he gazed at the woods, old thoughts resurfaced without warning, memories of when life seemed too simple to question. He recalled the first fall, the sudden pain, the panic in his father's eyes, and the silence that followed in the days afterward. He had never spoken about it, not even to himself. Now, standing on that path, he felt that the story wasn't just about what had happened, but about everything that had been interrupted afterward. The feeling was that something essential had been suspended in time, awaiting recognition. At that same time, the healer returned home with slow but firm steps. The physical effort was visible, yet there was no weariness in her eyes. Upon arriving, she sat down at the simple table and opened the bundle of herbs, carefully spreading them out. The scent that filled the air was deep, earthy, almost familiar, as if awakening memories that were not hers alone. Her fingers touched each leaf with respectful attention, and the silence around her seemed to adjust to that ancient gesture, laden with meaning. Ethan remained there for long minutes, feeling the cold slowly creep up his motionless legs, but without any real discomfort. What troubled him was not his body, but his mind, overwhelmed by questions he had always avoided. He thought about what the healer had said about the path, about beginnings and ends, and felt a tightness in his chest as he realized how much he had resisted any form of change. For the first time, he considered that the pain itself could be an invitation, not a punishment, something that demanded listening, not denial. When he decided to return home, he did so reluctantly, like someone turning away from something important before fully understanding the reason. As he was being led back, he cast one last glance at the trail, noticing a detail he hadn't seen before, a small mark in the dirt, almost erased, as if someone had stopped there recently. The image remained etched in his mind, bringing with it the unsettling certainty that this story was far from over, and that the true confrontation still awaited, silently, further ahead. That night, the wind swept across Hazel Creek with a different sound, more continuous, almost dragging, as if traversing the land in search of something specific. Ethan stayed awake, listening to each variation of the noise, feeling his body tired and his mind restless. The room seemed smaller, closer, and the ceiling too low to contain the thoughts that insisted on expanding. There was a gentle pressure in his chest, not painful, just constant, like a reminder that something needed to be faced without delay. Around midnight, he had the distinct impression of hearing footsteps outside, not hurried, but careful, respecting the rhythm of the night. The sound came from the direction of the trail, approached, and then ceased, as if whoever was walking knew exactly where to go. Ethan held his breath, not out of fear, but out of a strange feeling of recognition. It didn't seem like an intrusion, but an approach. For the first time, he didn't wish the sound would disappear too quickly. In the forest house, the healer remained awake, seated before a small candle whose flame barely illuminated the room. She observed the movement of the light on the walls as if reading ancient signs. At a certain moment, she placed her hand on her chest, took a deep breath, and closed her eyes, as if confirming something she had felt since the previous day. There was no doubt, only acceptance. The ancestral wisdom she carried demanded no haste, only preparation for what was to come. At dawn, Ethan awoke with a strange sensation in his legs, not of pain, but of presence. It was as if the part of his body that had always seemed distant was somehow closer to his consciousness. He tried to move his fingers without success, but felt no immediate frustration. There was a new, disconcerting calmness there, as if his body were responding in a different, more subtle way. This left him confused and alert at the same time, unable to ignore what was happening. As the day began, a simple rumor spread through the village, passed carefully by word of mouth. They said the healer had been seen near the Caldwell farm, and that when that happens, something always changes, even if no one can say exactly what. Ethan heard it from afar, without knowing who was speaking, but he felt the weight of the words settle within him. The certainty that accompanied him was clear. This proximity was no coincidence, and whatever was forming could no longer be stopped. The day dragged on slowly, as if each hour carried a heavier weight than it should. Ethan spent almost the entire morning in silence, watching the light filter through the windows and cast shadows on the floor. There was a feeling of suspension in the air, something between expectation and restraint, difficult to explain. He thought about how many times he had ignored similar signs throughout his life, always choosing the most predictable, safest path. Now, however, predictability seemed to have lost its meaning, replaced by an unease that demanded sincere attention. In the early afternoon, one of the oldest employees cautiously approached and commented that the trail was different, as if the ground had been disturbed during the night. He didn't speak of fear, only of strangeness. Ethan listened with his heart racing, feeling that each detail was beginning to fit into a larger sequence. The idea that something was being prepared, not visibly but internally, began to become clear. There was a discrete energy in motion, silent yet constant, that seemed to permeate everything around. In the forest house, the healer arranged small objects on the table, each one carefully chosen, each gesture laden with contained intention. There was no hurry, no dramatization. She would stop, breathe, touch an item, wait a few seconds before continuing. At a certain moment, she closed her eyes and tilted her head, as if listening to something too distant to be heard otherwise. The atmosphere seemed to adjust to her rhythm, as if recognizing that ancient and respectful presence. Ethan again asked to be taken to the balcony overlooking the trail, ignoring the resistance of his companion. As he approached the edge between the house and the woods, he felt a slight chill run through his body, not unpleasant, just intense. The smell of the earth was stronger, and the silence seemed laden with meaning. He thought about the healer's words, at the beginning and the end, and realized that perhaps he was facing a choice he could no longer postpone, even without fully understanding its consequences. As the sun began to set, an elderly figure appeared at the beginning of the path, advancing slowly, leaning on a familiar branch. The healer approached without haste, as if respecting the time of each step. Ethan felt his heart pound, not with fear, but with a profound certainty. This approach marked the closing of a silent cycle and the opening of another still shrouded in mystery. He knew, with an almost painful clarity, that nothing from then on would remain exactly as before. The healer moved forward until the shadows of the trees touched the edge of the veranda, stopping there as if that spot had been chosen beforehand. The branch resting against her body trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from the controlled effort of someone who knows their own limits. Her gaze swept across the space unhurriedly, as if measuring something invisible, and then landed on Ethan with an attention that neither judged nor consoled. He felt a weight in his chest, not of fear, but of recognition, as if he were standing before someone who already knew him even before that encounter. Without drawing any closer, the healer said that certain paths only reveal themselves when the body stops fighting against what the soul is trying to say. The phrase was simple, spoken in a low, almost neutral tone, but it struck Ethan with unexpected force. There was no promise of healing, no veiled threat, only the realization of something he had always known and avoided admitting. The energy of that moment seemed to suspend time around them, making the silence thick, difficult to break. The employees watched from a distance, no one daring to interfere. Walter wasn't there, and that absence took on a strange meaning, as if it were necessary for that conversation to happen. Ethan realized that, for the first time, he didn't feel the need to explain anything, nor to defend himself. There was an uncomfortable acceptance, but also a silent relief. The exciting story unfolding didn't require immediate courage, only a willingness not to run away from what was presented. The healer inclined her head slightly, as if quietly concluding a chapter. She said she would return when the place was ready, not the house, but him. She didn't explain how she would know or when. She simply turned slowly and began her way back, each step marking the earth gently. Ethan followed her movements until her figure blended into the shadows of the woods, feeling a strange emptiness, mixed with a restrained expectation. As night fell, Hazel Creek seemed to hold its breath. Ethan stayed awake, staring into the darkness beyond the window, sensing something larger approaching, not as a threat, but as an inevitable confrontation. He knew the next encounter would require more than silent observation. There was a clear, almost heavy certainty that what was to come would test everything he thought he knew about himself, about his own body, and about the boundaries between the visible and what had always been there, waiting to be faced. Dawn fell over Hazel Creek with a different weight, as if the air had thickened around the big house. Ethan felt it even lying there, unable to sleep, the silence vibrating in a way that wouldn't allow rest. Each minute seemed to push him toward an inevitable point, a clear feeling that something was about to happen, with or without his permission. His body remained still, but inside there was intense movement, as if old barriers were being slowly pushed to their limit. It wasn't pure fear, it was the unsettling realization that the time for postponing had ended. Just before dawn, a different scent wafted through the room, bringing with it a memory that didn't originate in the mind, but in the body. It was an earthy, slightly bitter aroma that awakened something ancient, deep, almost forgotten. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling the energy of that scent spread through his chest, as if reorganizing scattered sensations. The memory of doctors, exams, and diagnoses lost its power in the face of that subtle presence, which promised nothing but demanded full attention. He had the distinct impression that the environment itself was being prepared for something greater. In the woods, the healer walked with visible effort, but with silent determination. Each step seemed aligned with a precise intention, as if her body knew exactly how far it could go. She stopped a few times, touching the ground, closing her eyes, feeling the rhythm of the earth beneath her feet. There was no doubt in her gestures, only a profound, almost reverent care. The ancestral wisdom she carried was not manifested in words, but in that silent reading of the invisible, adjusting the right moment to intervene. As the sun began to rise, Ethan felt a sharp pressure in his chest, followed by a wave of heat that coursed through his entire body. There was no sharp pain, just an unexpected intensity that made him hold his breath. For a moment he wanted to call someone, but he restrained the impulse. There was a sudden understanding that this process did not allow for curious witnesses. He closed his eyes and allowed the sensation to pass, feeling vulnerable, exposed, as if something essential was being touched without delicacy, but with precision. That same morning, a simple message arrived at the house, brought by someone who wouldn't be long. The healer would return before nightfall, and there was no need to prepare anything other than silence. The message didn't sound like a request, but rather a statement of fact. Ethan listened to it with a racing heart, sensing that the approaching encounter wouldn't bring easy answers or comfortable guarantees. Something bigger was about to be revealed, not completely, but enough to definitively change the course of that story. The rest of the day passed as if suspended by an invisible thread. Ethan felt time moving forward, but everything around him seemed to slow down. The sounds more distant, the colors slightly muted. The large house, so solid and imposing, now conveyed a sense of silent fragility. He spent hours watching the light shift on the walls, feeling his own body react in subtle ways. A warmth that came and went, a slight tingling that brought no pain, only awareness. The sensation was of being slowly led to a point from which there would be no turning back. As the afternoon wore on, old thoughts began to emerge with unexpected force. Ethan remembered interrupted conversations, hasty decisions, words never spoken after the accident. There was a silent guilt there, not only for himself but for the burden he felt he had become for his father, for his family, for that land. The prosperity that had always surrounded his life now seemed a distant scene, unable to fill the inner void that was becoming impossible to ignore. He realized with discomfort that perhaps he had never stopped running away, only chosen a more acceptable form of immobility. As the sun began to set, the silence of the forest deepened, becoming almost respectful. No birds sang, no insects dared to break that strange interval. Ethan felt his heart race, not from uncontrolled anxiety, but from absolute focus, as if his whole body were turned towards a single instant. It was the same sensation he had had during the healer's first visit, now amplified, closer, more concrete. Something within him recognized this state as a threshold, a point of passage. In the house near the trees, the healer arranged the space with minimal gestures, Nothing was moved without reason, nothing was added unnecessarily. She lit a small flame and remained there for a few minutes, simply observing, as if listening to something beyond human comprehension. Her face showed no effort, only deep concentration. There was a clear awareness that what was to come concerned not only the body of a man, but ancient marks, prolonged interruptions, a flow that needed to be resumed with extreme care. Just before nightfall, the elderly figure reappeared at the edge of the trail, advancing slowly as if each step were a silent confirmation. Ethan sensed her approach before seeing her, feeling the air adjust around him. There was no announcement, no call. Her presence was enough to make everything around him seem to align. He knew in that instant that the approaching encounter would allow no distractions or defenses, only conscious surrender to whatever was revealed, even if it remained incomplete. The healer entered the house without asking permission, not out of disrespect, but because that moment no longer obeyed common conventions. The interior seemed to shrink slightly in her presence, as if the walls recognized something too old to contest. Ethan felt his chest tighten as he watched her approach, not out of fear, but out of a clear sense of exposure. It was as if every unspoken thought, every contained emotion was now on the surface, too visible to be hidden. She stopped before him and remained silent for a few seconds, long enough for him to understand that this silence was part of the process. Without touching him, the healer asked everyone to step back. Her voice was low, firm, leaving no room for questioning. When they were alone, the atmosphere changed almost imperceptibly, the air denser, the light softer, as if time had slowed down. Ethan tried to speak, but no words seemed adequate. She only said that the body holds what the mind refuses to confront, and that certain pauses don't happen by chance. That sentence struck a deep chord, bringing to the surface memories he believed he had overcome, but which had only been pushed away from his consciousness. The healer brought a small bowl of water and asked him to immerse his hands. Ethan obeyed, feeling the initial chill slowly spread. There was no elaborate ritual, just simple, almost domestic gestures, but laden with silent intention. She attentively observed each reaction, each altered breath, as if reading invisible signs. At a certain point, she asked him to close his eyes and breathe deeply, not to relax, but to feel. The energy in that space seemed to circulate slowly, deeply, reorganizing something that had been misaligned for a long time. With his eyes closed, Ethan felt a wave of emotions rise without warning. Sadness, anger, fear, all mixed together, without a defined form. The urge to stop it was strong, almost irresistible, but he remained. The healer spoke little, only guiding him not to fight against what arose. There was no promise of immediate relief, only the silent insistence that going through this discomfort was necessary. He realized, with disconcerting clarity, that the greatest blockage had never been the body, but the resistance to revisiting certain memories and accepting what they carried. When the process ended, there was no announcement of completion. The healer simply stepped back a step and observed Ethan in silence. His body remained still, but something inside seemed different, more awake, more alert. There was no sense of miracle, just a subtle yet profound change, as if an ancient flow had been gently reactivated. She said that this was only the beginning, not the end, and that what had been interrupted was beginning to remember how to move again, albeit slowly. After the healer left, the silence remained thick, not as an absence of sound, but as an active presence. Ethan felt his body heavy, yet different, as if something had been displaced from an old place and was still searching for a new position. His breathing was deeper, more irregular, and his heart beat at a rhythm he didn't recognize. There was no immediate relief, nor clear pain, only the uncomfortable feeling that something essential had been touched and could not be ignored again. This required time, attention, and silent courage. The healer picked up the bowl, dried her hands with a simple cloth, and sat for a moment, as if listening to the space. He said that the body responds when the mind stops negotiating with fear, and that health doesn't begin where the eyes see, but where truth is accepted. The words didn't come as an explanation, but as minimal, sufficient guidance. Ethan didn't answer. He felt that any attempt at rational understanding would diminish what was happening. There was an ancient wisdom there that couldn't be contained in complete sentences. Shortly after, Walter cautiously entered the room, immediately noticing that something had changed. He didn't ask what had been done, only observed his son with a different look, less defensive, more attentive. The healer said that the process wasn't over, and that the coming days would require silence, observation, and respect for the body's limits. She didn't speak of guarantees or quick results. She only stated that long interruptions take their toll when the flow tries to return. Walter nodded, still uncomfortable, but without arguing. That night, Ethan slept soundly for the first time in years. The sleep wasn't peaceful. It was intense, full of disjointed images, paths that opened and closed, voices that asked for nothing, only accompanied him. Upon waking, he felt his body warm, tired, as after prolonged exertion. His legs remained still, but there was a new, almost imperceptible sensation, as if something was slowly being remembered from within. There was no frustration, only careful attention to what was manifesting. Before leaving, the healer approached Ethan and said she would return when her body asked for it, not when her mind demanded it. She lightly touched the ground with the branch, as if marking an invisible point, and withdrew without formal farewells. When the door closed, the house seemed larger, quieter, heavy with expectation. Ethan remained motionless, sensing that the main confrontation was yet to come, not as a spectacle but as a profound adjustment between what had been interrupted and what insisted on continuing. The following days passed without haste, but filled with an unusual awareness. Ethan felt his body respond in subtle ways, small waves of heat, a different weight in his legs, not like pain, but like a constant presence. His mind tried to understand, measure, compare with old promises, but something within him learned to observe without interfering. There was a slow energy reorganizing itself, demanding patience and silence. For the first time, he realized that true health might not be the absence of limits, but the ability to listen to what his body had been asking for years. On the third night, the healer returned unannounced. The house recognized her arrival before the people did. She found Ethan awake, as if he had been expecting her. Without long words, she asked to be taken to the beginning of the trail, where the earth became softer and the air more humid. There, under the dim moonlight, she guided him through simple gestures, slow breathing, and mindful attention to the weight of his own body. There was no visible physical exertion, only an intense, silent internal struggle, where fear, guilt, and resistance clashed with the profound will to move forward. At one point, Ethan felt an intense pressure rising up his legs, not as movement but as a bodily memory. The impulse to stop was immediate, almost instinctive, but the healer simply said that going through the discomfort was part of the process. He took a deep breath, feeling his whole body tremble slightly. There was no visible miracle, no step taken that night. What happened was something deeper, an internal adjustment, as if an old lock had been released, not completely, but enough to allow the flow to return. When it was all over, the healer remained silent for a few moments, observing Ethan with respectful attention. She said only that true prosperity begins when the body and history cease to fight each other. She explained nothing more. As she walked away, she made it clear that the path ahead would require time, care, and daily courage. There was no guarantee of how nor when, only the certainty that his destiny was no longer condemned to stagnation. Something essential had been reactivated, still fragile, but alive. Months later, Hazel Creek witnessed subtle changes. Ethan no longer walked as in his old dreams, but began to move in ways that had previously seemed impossible. Small, silent, consistent advances. The farm continued to prosper, but something there had transformed in a more profound way. The healer was never seen frequently again, only mentioned in respectful whispers. Ethan knew that this exciting story hadn't ended with a spectacular miracle, but with something rarer, the slow and conscious resumption of a destiny that had been interrupted, not destroyed. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share it so more people can discover stories like this. And if you want to continue immersing yourself in this universe of mystery, spirituality, and ancestral wisdom, click on one of the suggested stories on the final screen and follow along.